Hello. This sermon audio is a ministry of the Town Church in Fort Collins, Colorado. If you would like to learn more about us, how to connect, or how to support us, go to our website, thetownchurch.org. While listening to the Bible preached is a healthy part of our spiritual formation, it is not the whole picture. So if you aren't a part of a local church, we encourage you to prayerfully commit to a local body of believers where you live. We're glad you can join us, and we hope God uses the following sermon to reveal more of His glory to you.
Good morning. Good morning. It's good to see you all. My name is Vince. I'm one of the elders here, the teaching pastor. If we haven't met, I would love to meet you at some point. I'll be up here after our time together today. I'll go ahead and dismiss the 5-year-olds through 5th grade this morning. We do this first and third Sundays of the month. They go back. They'll be back there this morning. They'll take them out, and they're looking through the same passage that we look through every week as well. So they're learning some of the same things. So parents, if you have time this week, which you do, to interact with your child about the things that you're learning and we're learning together, I would encourage you to do that. Okay? Grab your Bible. Turn to Exodus 23. Exodus 23 is what we're looking at this morning. If you'll go ahead and grab it. We've been working through Exodus as a church over the last month, and we'll continue until we finish. So Exodus, if you're unfamiliar with where that is in the Bible, there should be a Bible there near you. If you're unfamiliar with that, that's fine. It's near the front, right after Genesis, which is the first book. You've got Exodus, and then 23. Look for the big numbers. 23 is the chapter number there, so you'll find that. Okay? As we've worked through the first 22 chapters, one of the main themes that has been flowing through chapter after chapter is this, that God's purpose of freeing the Israelite people, God's purpose and the point of freeing the Israelite people was what? What was the intent of God's freeing His people from slavery? Why has He saved His people from slavery? Do you remember? We've walked through this week after week after week, that God's people have been enslaved in Egypt. They've been there generation after generation after generation. 400 plus years they've been enslaved under harsh kings, the pharaohs of Egypt. They've been enslaved. And then one man, a Hebrew, named Moses, it gets in some trouble and runs from Egypt. And he runs out to Midian, where he meets his wife and begins working for her father as a shepherd. And while he's in the wilderness, a really strange thing happens. While he's there, the voice of God comes from a bush that is on fire, right? And instead of running away, which is what any of us would have done, he moves toward the voice, and God begins to speak to Moses some very powerful words showing God's compassion, some very powerful words showing God's plan for His people. And so I want us to think back on those words. So we go all the way back to Exodus 3, and here's what it says. Then the Lord said, this is God speaking to Moses from this bush. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Keep those names in mind as we get further into 23. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh. He's talking to Moses. Come, I'll send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, but I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Now, That goes back several chapters, but this is this interaction that Moses has with God all the way back to chapter 3, and this promise is from God, a promise that would be fulfilled with a sign. And what's the sign? What's the mark that this promise has been fulfilled? That when the people are brought out of Egypt, they will be freed, they will be saved from Egypt. They will do what? They will serve God on this mountain. They will worship God on this mountain. So we see this long progression now of where they are, and God sends Moses as his representative to talk to Pharaoh about this plan. Of course, Pharaoh's not keen on his whole slave labor being released at once, and so God, he says no, and so God brings in plague after plague after plague after plague to Pharaoh, to his people, on his people, to show them who is in control. To show Pharaoh and his people who is in control. And with every plague, God has Moses tell Pharaoh what? You tell Pharaoh that he is to let my people go so that, the same thing, so that they can come and worship me. That's the point. That's the point of God releasing the people, freeing the people from slavery so that they would be able to go and worship God. That's the point. And God desires undivided attention from those who will follow him. God desires and demands our worship. The very reason he saved the people, the very reason he has redeemed a people from slavery is so that they may worship him. That's the point. So that they would be able to go and worship him. Now listen, friends, the very reason that God has made us, created us, is so that we would worship him in all of life. In all of life. The worship of God is not just about our time here on Sunday morning. We get that, right? It's not just about us singing a few songs when we get here on Sunday morning. The worship of God happens in all of life, in every aspect of life, that our eyes may be fixed on the Lord of heaven and earth. God created us to worship him alone, and if that's why he created us and saved us to himself, then we can be certain that all of life is about that. Does that make sense? Let me say that again. If God created us to worship him in all of life, then we can be sure that all of life is about that, worshiping him. And that's not just something we've made up to get you to come here on a Sunday morning. Right? That's not something we've made up to help us feel better. In fact, these are laws that are written into what we've seen as the covenant code. Over the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've walked through these few chapters that have been called the covenant code, where we see the people of God being commanded, given laws about how they are to worship God. These aren't arbitrary laws just to get people to jump through hoops. Right? These aren't from God to show that he's in control. Hey, if they do these things, then it'll show them that I'm in control. This is God speaking to the people to bring them into relationship with him. The point of this is worship. And so this morning, in the final verses of chapter 23, we see God giving laws to the Israelite people, calling them to rest. Laws calling them to rest. Laws calling them to feast, and laws calling them to obedient devotion. All of that as a way for them to worship him alone. The point of these commands is worship. And so as we've done over the last weeks, we'll break these up into specific laws. We'll work through them one by one. So let's look at the first one. Chapter 23, we'll start in verse 10. That's where we pick up this week. Look at verse 10. It says this, a few verses here. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat. And what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest. And the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. Pay attention to all that I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods. nor let it be heard on your lips. Here's what we see from those very first verses, that God commands worship in rest. God commands worship in rest. If we look at these commands in depth, I think we can see that the point is worship through intentional, set aside rest in all of life. We see in the commands in verses 10 and 11 that about rest every seventh year, and then in verse 12, every seventh day. So God is setting up an order of how the people ought to be resting. God is commanding His people to worship in their rest. To worship in their rest. And these commands, again, just like we've seen with so many of God's commands, we see God's heart. So these aren't just laws that are separate, out there, but we see the heart of God. He's concerned about His people most of all. And in the midst of that, He's concerned about animals and land, dirt too. Right? And so let's just walk through those. In verse 10, God says, the people must farm their land for 6 years. Year after year after year. For 6 years, they're to farm their land for provision for their families. They're to farm. They're to farm into the land and to gather fruit from the field. Right? So they're to harvest that. However, the law states on the seventh year, they're to allow the field to rest, to lie fallow. Now, this is a minor detail, but something I think we ought to look at. We can see some principles here. The ground, the soil, the dirt needs time, set aside time to rest and to be restored and to receive nutrients. It needs time to be set aside. And I don't know much about farming, which is probably a shock to many of you. But from what I've read, it's been shown that even the dirt needs rest. That even the dirt needs time to replenish after years and years of being depleted of its resources. And listen, God has built into law. He's built into law a Sabbath for the earth, or a stoppage. That's literally what it means, a stopping time for the earth, for the land. And allowing the soil to rest and to not be farmed takes what from the farmer? What does it take? To allow the land just to sit, what does that take from the farmer? It takes faith, doesn't it? Deep, deep faith that God will provide. For the family who is leaning on the crop for their sustenance, for their provision, not farming that plot of land for a year takes faith that God will provide in some other way. In some other way that they don't yet know. And so if you remember, God has already given hints of this, hasn't He? He's already given hints of this all the way back in Exodus 16 when the people were wandering in the wilderness without food. He provided food for the people through manna, through bread. And He provided food for the people through quail. And so every morning for how many days? 6 days, they awoke and they go out and they find flaky white bread, honey-tasting bread everywhere. And for 6 days, they're to gather that bread. And for 6 days in the evening, the land is covered with quail. All of that provided for by God. For 6 days that happens. And on the seventh day, nothing. Right? Nothing. And what does that take for the people? What was the lesson there for the people? Trust. You've got to rest and trust in God. It takes faith that God would provide. God commanded rest for the people on that seventh day. So we've already seen hints of this. And in their rest, they have to trust that God would provide. And while this isn't directly what God is commanding here, I think we can take principles from this about our own rest. So I'm comparing us to dirt here, all right? But we can take principles from this. After periods of time of depletion of resources, humans also need time to replenish and be renewed. Don't we? We need time to be renewed. This is why many churches, Christian organizations will offer a sabbatical which comes from Sabbath, which means stoppage. They'll offer a sabbatical during the 7th year, a forced set-aside time for the people, for the person to have no work. In other companies, other organizations, industries have done that as well, but often in those other organizations, what they will do is, the purpose of it is that the employee will go do more work, right? They'll write a book, they'll do something that will show for themselves that they are worth keeping around, doing research or something like that. But often a church or someone who's in tune with what Scripture says and what God has commanded, often for the church who offers a healthy sabbatical, the thought is this: that after years of depleting the resources of the person involved in the work, time is needed and therefore given so that the person is able to rest, to be restored, to have resources replenished. It's desperately needed, and we can't, I think you know this, we can't simply use all of our resources provided and then think that we can just continue going. There must be time for us to replenish, and that takes what? It takes faith, doesn't it? It takes faith that while we rest, the work is continuing on, or God's got something else in store. It takes faith that God will provide what is needed during that rest. Now, here's an example. We had an example of this last week, where we brought Josh and Liz McGeehan up here to the front, stood them in front of you. We circled around them and prayed for them. Josh and Liz McGeehan have served faithfully with Cru for many, many years, serving the campus, the CSU's campus. For many years, they've poured time and energy and resources into students here in New Zealand, and so they've poured themselves into that. And in many ways, just like the soil, their resources have been depleted over their years of pouring into the ministry that God's called them to be a part of. And so as a gift, Cru, in keeping with the heart and commands of God, has offered them some time away. Now listen, what does that take on their part? On the part of Cru, it takes faith, right? Because Cru now at CSU is without these faithful workers. But the school year goes on, and so they're without it. But for the long-term health of the organization and for Liz and Josh are receiving the rest they need to continue the work they've been called to do. Does that make sense? Setting aside time to be renewed, to come back and serve faithfully. God cares for His people. God cares for His people and desires the worship of His people. And so He shows us examples of His care, even in how He puts into law rest given to the soil, and that the kind of faith it takes for us to allow the land to lie fallow. Verse 11 picks up with that, continues. Not only does God care for the land He's created, but He also cares for the people. I would say more than the land, He cares for the people. And part of the reason God commands people to allow their fields to rest is so that the poor among them will be able to forage for food in the resting field. So after the harvest, there were certainly crops that were left behind. In fact, it was often that the people would leave crops behind so that those who were in need would be able to come back and get food. The poor would be cared for. This is the heart of God, showing the care for those who are poor by His commands to allow the ground to be untouched. God's caring for His people. There's this constant rotation of different fields that were in their 7th year, which would consistently then provide for those in need in different pockets of the surrounding area. We're told then that vineyards and orchards must be on that same kind of rotation, and not just for the poor, but also for the animals, that they would be able to eat as well. Listen, God is sustaining His creation, upholding and providing for His creation through the command of letting the ground lie fallow on that 7th year. We have a God who is intentional. We have a God who is intentional and organized in his provision for his creation. This isn't some haphazard provision. There's order and systems in place, laws being given so that this kind of provision would happen. All of that in order, all of that in this order follows and flows from God. In verse 12 we read, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Now who else do we know who did that? I'm going to ask you because I want to see if you're awake. There we go, right? If the kids were in here, they would have nailed that, right? You all, not so much. But God also did that, right? God, He's our example in this. Genesis 1, we see God creating all things by speaking them into existence. And we're told in Genesis 2, this is what happens. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished His work that He had done. And He rested on the seventh day from His work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it God rested from all His work that He had done in creation. Is that because God's tired? Or is that because God's resources were tapped, right? And now He's done? Of course it isn't. God is setting into motion a pattern of set aside periods of time to rest, to be restored. To be renewed. God is setting into motion a pattern of setting aside time to focus intently on God, resting in, trusting in His provision, putting into motion a pattern for us. Now, this is not something that we do well, is it? A pattern of regular rest. In general, this is not something that we do well. I was just talking to Eric about this past week, my own failures in this very thing. Kirsten and I, my wife and I, had we'll call it a discussion about my failures in this over the last years. We just had that discussion on Friday. I have an extremely difficult time pulling away from work to allow for me a time for me to focus intently on God and resting and being renewed. I have an extremely difficult time from pulling away from the busyness so that I can be renewed and restored. So my resources can be replenished. And really here's the damning part of that confession. Often when I say something like that or talk about those things, I'm saying that in hopes that people will look at me and think that I'm an extremely productive person. Does that make sense? That I'll say, I just have a hard time pulling away, I just like to get in there and get some work done. And often I'll say that so that people will look at me and see that I am productive. And I don't know how many times I've heard myself or others say things like, I worked 60 hours last week, or this is the 23rd straight month I've been at work, or something like that, where we put that out in front of others to get the approval of others that we're hard workers. But not pulling away from work for the purpose of set aside time to rest in God's sweet provision and renewal and restoration is sin. And we put it out there as good, right? It's sin to not set aside time to rest and be restored and renewed. God commands us to worship in rest because rest automatically forces us to trust. To trust. I don't want to jump to application for you, but I do want to put in front of each of us, I think myself included, or maybe myself primarily, that we desperately need to think seriously about time set aside for the purpose of resting in God's provision. So what could that look like for you? Maybe you're saying, well, sabbatical, that sounds nice. My company would not give me time away like they've done for Josh and Liz at all. So how am I supposed to do it? Maybe not. But what would it look like for you? What would it look like for you to pull away weekly or to pull away monthly or annually to spend some time being renewed, being refreshed, being restored? Maybe you start with weekly. One day a week you don't open your email, right? Some may say, well, that'd be easy. But is it? Or not turning on your phone, just leaving it. Not turning it on or not stopping by the office? What would it look like for you to not consider work in some way, or not, students, take this with a little bit of hesitancy, not studying, right? I know many of you are already doing that, right? Congratulations. But pulling away for a time to not study for the purpose of being renewed and refreshed and restored, or maybe not doing yard work on that free hour that you have to do yard work, just letting it be, or laundry or whatever that is. I'm not saying I think we need to do a better job of being lazy, right? I think we've done that. I think we can do that. We do well enough at wasting time. This command for us is about the worship of God in rest. It's different. It's about the worship of God in our rest, because this kind of rest forces us to trust in someone other than ourselves, the God of the universe. I think often we believe we're doing well at Sabbath when we sleep in or when we go for a hike, and that may be part of it. But the question ought to be there: how is the rest that I am pursuing helping me trust more in God? And in trusting more in God, how is it turning this set-aside time into intentional worship of God? Maybe asking that question. That was a long one, right? But maybe asking a question like that. How is this set-aside time actually forcing me to trust God, and in that trust then turning to worship Him? God commands worship in rest. We see that in verse 13, where God says, "Pay attention to all that I've said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips." That seems like a strange one right after those commands, but here's what he's getting at. Don't lean on, in any way, the worship of other gods, of other idols. Don't lean toward reliance on yourself or in anything that pulls you away from the one true God. Don't lean in the direction of what the world is saying you ought to be doing. That's what I think we often do. Don't lean in that direction. This law is a command about worshiping the one true God. And then God continues with yet another set of laws in verses 14 through 19. Let's read through those. We've already seen these remembrances of Him that are put into place. Remembrance of Him every 7 years, which we just read about. We've seen that God shows His people that they could put into practice ways of remembering Him, worshiping Him in every year. In fact, here we see 3 times a year. So look at verse 14. It says, 3 times in the year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. As I commanded you, you shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. You shall keep the feast of harvest, of the firstfruits of your labor, of what you sow in the field. You shall keep the feast of ingathering. At the end of the year, when you gather in from the field the fruit of your labor. 3 times in the year shall all your males appear before the Lord God. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain until morning. The best of the firstfruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Write it down, note it, all right? Here's what we see. Here's what we see in this, that yes, God is commanding us worship in rest, and He's also commanding worship in feast. In feast. This is the kind of God we have a God who cares for us. Worship in rest, worship in feast. These laws are elaborated on in other Old Testament books. Here we just get these one sentence, quick laws that show us, wrap up the final verses of this covenant code, seeing hints of these 3 festivals that are elaborated on in other books. First, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? This feast is to commemorate and to bring to remembrance the time of Exodus. Do you remember this? Where God commanded the people to be ready for the Exodus by not putting leaven in their breads, right? This would allow for a quick escape. When the angel of the Lord passed over their homes, they would be able to get out quickly. Don't put leaven in your breads. You don't have time for that to rise. Let's move, right? So God commanded the people to eat unleavened bread for 7 days, every day for a week, in the same month that the people were freed from slavery, right? That command also included some kind of offering to God. So we see that it's worship. It includes an offering to God. No one should come to me empty-handed, God says. This is an indication that this is a feast and a celebration of what God has done. It's worship. Secondly, the Feast of Harvest. More details are given about that in Leviticus 23 if you want to read through that. But now, what we see here in this short verse is that God provides yet again through another successful harvest. That's what they're celebrating. Yes, God provided again through another successful harvest. And then third, and finally, we see the Feast of Ingathering. It's also described in Leviticus 23, a celebration, a feast commemorating the end of the year of God's provision during that year. This celebration would be marked by the people temporarily staying in booths or in tents to commemorate the time when the people camped in the wilderness after the Exodus. So God is setting up in a rhythm for the people 3 feasts where offerings would be made, sacrifices would be made to God. 3 times a year they were to appear before the Lord in worship, worshiping God as the one true God. That's the point, that this is all about worship. That's what verses 18 and 19 show us as it wraps that up, that this is about the worship of God alone. These feasts are about the worship of God, not just some ritual, not just some ritual and command so that they could check a box and be obedient. But it was a feast. A feast. This is about the worship of God and commemorating all that God has done. Feasts that show us that there are to be set aside times for the people of God to feast and celebrate all of what He has done, and at the same time to be completely separate from the pagan religions. You must not be like them at all. So that's what we see in those verses 18 and 19. Verse 18, many believe that the pagan religions around them would drink blood. That's why they say don't put any blood into anything that's leavened, because blood tastes so horrible just to drink. They would drink it to bring in the life of the animal and to extend their life. That's what they thought. And so God says, don't even put blood into the things that you bake. That would make it more palatable for you. Don't be like the pagan cultures at all. Likewise, the fat of the animal that was to be sacrificed to the Lord, many pagan religions would keep the fat until the next day. Some of them eating it, some of them sacrificing it, but God says, no, it's to be sacrificed, offered to me. You must not be like them at all. Do not be like them at all. This is about the right worship of God. And in addition to that, this final command about not boiling a young goat in its mother's milk, which you're all wondering about. By the way, this is in several different places in the Old Testament that we're given this law. It's a command to not be like pagan religions in this way, that what brought life to a young goat was its mother's milk, right? And so the thought was that in boiling a young goat in its own mother's milk, there was this fertility ritual that would cause the people doing that sacrifice to become more fertile. So it was a pagan ritual that they would do, and so God is saying, no, don't be like these pagans at all. Over and over and over again, God's saying you must not be like them, those people around you. You cannot imitate them in any way. You're to worship me alone in the feasts that I've commanded of you. They are feasts that are very different than all of your pagan neighbors. Very different. In fact, all of the feasts that the Lord commands are about what? I don't know if you caught this. All of the feasts that the Lord commands are about God's provision, not about self. not about making myself fertile or making myself live longer or making myself this or that, but they're all about commemorating and celebrating what God has done. It's all pointing to God. God is commanding this for his people, and it may seem like a side point. I think it's probably worth noting this. But this is all corporate in nature. These feasts are corporate in nature, right? It's corporate in nature that all these people would come together to do these feasts collectively, corporately, together. It's a feast, a celebration of and worship of God. It's not a feast if you're alone. Is that true? Right? When your family goes out of town, or your friends go out of town, you don't prepare a feast, right? It's Lucky Charms, right? That's what you do, or whatever that is, right? The single-serve macaroni and cheese, or whatever nasty thing that you can peel the tin off the top of. It's that. You don't prepare a feast for yourself. It is something that is to be done in corporate gathering. In fact, one book I read this past week, I think this simple sentence was very helpful. Full biblical worship is always corporate. Full, not all, but full biblical worship is always corporate. Meaning that God saves a people to himself, and commands a people collectively to worship him. He's only saved you as an individual insofar as he's saved you as one of the individuals of many. He's brought you into a people as his own possession and fame. So think about that in terms of our regular gathering here on Sundays. Well, this is not what's being commanded in Exodus 23, so don't try to figure out how Sunday gathering is figured out in here. But I think we can apply some of these principles, that we're saved together collectively as a people to feast together on the goodness of God. We're called together to do that. And you're missing out when you choose to neglect gathering together. And not only that, but we're missing out when you choose to neglect to gather. We are missing out as well. There's in addition to that, there's no accountability in the ways that you worship if you're worshiping alone. Does that catch? That there's no accountability in the God that you've made up when it's you and God alone. Now, there's time for that. But you can go off the rails quickly in what your thoughts are about God if not for the people around you. I could, right? If I said some crazy stuff up here, somebody would throw something at me, right? We need one another to stay in the direction of seeing who God is. When worshiping with the people of God, you have the people of God to help you direct you as the people of God to the right worship of God. We need one another. This is corporate. God commands worship and rest. God commands worship and feast. All of that pointing more and more to Him. I think this is extremely important for a group of people who have been enslaved for 400 plus years. So think about that. That they have been surrounded by pagan rituals. Or they've been surrounded by pagan rituals all of their lives, working tirelessly under harsh conditions, probably no break at all. Probably no rest for them at all, especially not for the purpose of worship. Right? Pharaoh was not letting them go do their thing over here on a Saturday afternoon. There's no rest, and so they're coming from pagan culture surrounded by it, where they're being worked to the bone. So this is huge for the people to hear from their caring God, isn't it? It's huge for them to hear from the God who cares for them and wants them to have rest and wants them to have feasting and wants them to be together in those things. And He cares so much for them that He wants relationship with them and gives them commands about how not to be like those around them. But think about this. Often we see the commands of God like hindrances to our fun. Don't we? We see the commands of God as hindrances to our fun. Why can't I do that? Why can't I do this? God just tells me what I can't do. Right? The laws of God are just things that I cannot do. But here's what I think we see in the final verses of this covenant code, that God is a Father who desires relationship and says to His people, don't be like the other cultures. Worship me in rest and worship me in feast. Enjoy Enjoy who I am. Worship me in that. And then at the end of that, we'll get into these verses. In obedience and devotion to me, there is abundant life. Worship me in devotion. So God's preparing a people to go into a land that He's promised them, a land flowing with milk and honey, a flourishing land. God's preparing His people to go into that. And so He's given them this covenant code for what is to come. And He says, you can worship me in rest, you can worship me in feast. And when you get to this new promised land, you'll be surrounded by people who do not worship me in rest or worship me in feast. And in that time, you can worship me in devotion to me alone. So He puts that out in front of them. Let's finish out the chapter. Look at verse 20. He says, "Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have prepared." This is the beginning of God telling them about what's to come, preparing them for what's to come. Verse 21, "Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I blot them out, you shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do as they do, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God, and He will bless your bread and your water. And I will take sickness away from among you. None shall miscarry or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come. And I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little I will drive them out before you until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you." Here's what we see: worship in devotion. That's what God's calling them to. Worship me in devotion to me. Worship me in rest, worship me in feast, but worship in devotion to me, exclusively devoted to me. You're about to enter into a place that's not devoted to me, and so I'm asking you, I'm calling you, I'm commanding you to be devoted to me. In me, you'll find protection from your enemies, from the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all of those people that God promised in Exodus 3 that they would come in and take over. Verse 25, he says, "The things that you lacked in the wilderness, bread and water, the Lord will give you." Verse 26, "Your people will flourish through fruitfulness and childbirth and in long life that comes from God." That's a gift. God goes on to say, "I'll drive away your enemies. I'll drive them away, but I'm not going to drive them away all at once, because then the wild animals would take over." I think that's kind of funny, but they would take over and you would then be stuck, right? So he says, I'm going to do that over time. God's got a plan. Your devotion is to me in exclusivity. Your devotion is to me. And I want us to see this. We'll finish here. I want us to see this. Look at verse 32 and 33 again. I want to read those verses again. At the very end of this covenant code to the people, these laws that he puts in front, God says, "You shall make no covenant with them and their gods." What's God saying? "But with me. You shall make no covenant with them or their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you." So here's what we have in these final verses of the covenant code: that God desires our full devotion. God promises to provide. God promises to protect. God promises to restore brokenness. God promises flourishing and abundant life. God promises to fulfill those things, and He's asking for complete devotion. You shall make no covenant with them, because your covenant's with me. You shall make no covenant with them, that you're to set aside time for rest, you're to set aside time for feasting. All of that is about worshiping me. Your direction and devotion is for me. Have nothing to do with idolatry. Listen, friends, here's our hope. God says clearly and plainly to the people, if you go into this land that I've promised and you begin to worship their gods, it's going to go poorly for you. There will not be victory over them. I'm providing victory over these people if you obey by not worshiping their gods, because God's a jealous God. He's a jealous God, desiring and deserving our full attention and worship. They were created, these people were created to worship God. For them to now go back into the land and be enslaved to worship foreign gods would be to go against the very reasons that God has created them and now freed them to go back. Seems foolish, doesn't it? And we would all warn them of the same thing. But don't we do the same? Don't we do the same? For those of you who are followers of Jesus, how quick are we to slip back into the ways of the world that seem advantageous? How quickly we slip back into dark and broken places that we've already experienced and God has pulled us from. How quick we are to assume that we're missing out on something better. It's often why we do it, right? That we're missing out on something better. If I could just go in that direction, when we have Christ and abundant life because of Him. We've been saved by Jesus for the purpose of worship, and there's freedom there. We've been saved at a great cost, the blood of God's own Son, and because of that, we have abundant, free life. Allow that to sit. We have a life of worship given to us freely because Jesus gave His life. This is spoken of throughout the entire New Testament. Jesus says, I've come to give you abundant life. Paul talks about these same kinds of things in a lot of his letters where he just talks over and over and over about this. He talks about new life in Ephesians 4, and he says that you're going back. You have new life. You're going back. That's not the way you learned Christ. You remember that? Ephesians 4, that's not the way you learned Christ. He says in Galatians 5, he says this, for freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. How have you learned Christ? Not under a burden, but in freedom. He has given us freedom so that we would worship freely. Is there rest in that this morning? Is there feasting in that this morning? Is there devoted worship of God because of that? Let me pray that there would be. Let's pray. God, we are thankful for your word. It's given to us as a gift. There are times when we have difficult times understanding it, following it, seeing what you're doing. Some of these laws are hard to wade through and to see how they apply and how they hit us. But overall, God, I pray, my prayer would be that we would see that you, God, are a caring God, that you care for us. That's why you give us ways that we can be in relationship with you through law, but we don't lean on law. And so, God, I pray that we wouldn't lean on law as the thing that saves, but you sent your Son to stand in our place. He came not to do away with the law, but to fulfill it in every way, being obedient, perfectly obedient. So I pray as we wade through laws like this, and maybe as we're reading through other places in Scripture, that we see law after law, that we would understand that these laws are given for our good and for our flourishing, but Christ came to fulfill them. Help us to stand in that, to rest in that. And God, I pray for each of us that we would have places in our lives where we would know how to and be disciplined enough to pull away, to rest, to be restored, to be renewed, to be refreshed in you, so that our eyes are fixed on you to worship you. I desperately need your help in that. So I pray that you would help me to not lean on my own abilities and my own work so much that I neglect to trust you in rest. God, I pray that we would be a joyful people, feasting and remembering what you've done, celebrating what you have done. Over and over and over, you've given us good gifts for our flourishing. Life in Christ you've given us. We're thankful. God, I pray that we would be a people of joyful worship. We need your help there. God, all these things we ask in the name of your Son, knowing that you hear us, you answer us, and you are calling us into relationship with you. Help us to believe that, we pray. Amen.